Okay, so Kristin, thanks first of all for taking the time to talk to me and the students at Waterloo who will be watching this. Can I just start by asking you to tell them about the role that you play now at the Centre for Automotive Research?
Sure. I'm the Vice President of Research at the Center for Automotive Research. You would think that was all we did was research, but we actually have 3 departments here. So we do a program that we call our affiliates program, where we interact with 70 or 80 corporate members, basically. We're a nonprofit, so these corporate members provide a contribution to Carr to support some of the industry-wide work that we do. We have a big conference that we do. It's the largest gathering of the industry in North America every August in Traverse City, Michigan. So conferences and events is a group, and then research is about half of our organization. So I'm the Vice President for Research. We cover in our research areas, my area is mainly business and economics, labor, where the industry is going, what products are allocated where. We work a lot with states and governments about incentives and what they're doing to attract and retain the businesses that they have in the automakers and the suppliers. We also have a group that looks at manufacturing issues, so manufacturing technology and Industry 4.0 and materials and things like that. And then it's actually a whole other group, it's called technology, but they also look at connected and automated vehicle technologies, mobility as a service, transportation systems, so the backhaul behind transportation networks. So we do a lot of work for departments of transportation. And that's the big area of research that we cover. So it's business and technology, but mainly in those areas.
Well, it sounds like you're the right person for me to speak to, because you're able to give an understanding of what's happening in the industry as a whole, which is what I'm keen that we get from the interview. So the next question really relates to that, which is how you would describe the changes that have been taking place in recent years in the automotive sector, and what you would consider to be the main changes that have been happening there.
Well, it feels like everything is changing all at once. We've had, in terms of the business cycle, we've had a fairly strong run up from the bankruptcies to very high levels of sales in North America. And Canadian sales don't vary all that much. U.S. does. Mexican sales don't vary very much either. But the U.S. tends to have a business cycle, a very strong business cycle. We're coming off a peak in 2016. It looks like a very soft and slow plateau. But still, we've had a lot of investment in North America, and reinvestment in plants, and a real strong comeback from the depths of 2008 and 2009. So the business cycle is fairly strong. Alongside that, there is just tremendous technological frontier. How we're making vehicles is changing a lot. Auto has always been highly automated, and some of the first industrial robots ever invented were installed in a General Motors plant. Going back to the 1960s, the first industrial robots we used in the auto industry. There was a huge automation push in the 80s, and now we're seeing a merger of sort of cyber and physical systems in the plants. So, it's not just that the processes are being automated, but there's a lot of data being thrown off from the systems, and data being used to control manufacturing and to run the plant. I don't know that that's I just did a study this last year looking at how smaller suppliers are modernizing and investing in technology, and oftentimes we saw that they may get a new, they've been doing fairly well financially as well. They may invest in a new press or a new piece of machinery and use it exactly the same way they used their old press, even though it has way more capabilities. So think about, your grandparents got a smart TV and they don't stream anything. They're not using all the capabilities of the new machines. So we found a lot of that. And so, that technology in the factory is changing. The technology in the vehicles is changing as well. And, we see companies like Ford, I think it was last year, said we're investing $11 billion in electrification and automation. And these are huge, big bets. And you can go back to, I can't remember what year it was, but the late Sergio Marchionne saying, in his Confessions of a Capital Junkie presentation, saying, we can't do this alone. And you see a lot of mergers and acquisitions and joint ventures in the electric vehicle and automated and connected vehicle spaces. So, General Motors buys this Cruise Automation, and they actually move an executive over there to help run Cruise, and then Honda puts money into Cruise Automation. So there's a lot of mix-up and partnerships on these very risky frontiers for vehicle technologies. Some of those vehicle technologies and some of these disruptions coming from the outside, like the mobility as a service, where people won't own cars, they'll just use cars as they need them. So a lot of thought to how do cars fit into that ecosystem, and even the automakers, the big automakers, are investing in scooter companies and micromobility, and General Motors had Maven as a car sharing operation, that you could go rent a car for an hour. Uber and Lyft and Waymo are really disrupting the automation space quite a bit. Waymo's really very far ahead on automation of the vehicles, but all of this stuff is changing all at once, and still, these are some of the most complex consumer goods anybody buys, the most expensive consumer goods anybody buys, with way more lines of code in it than anything else. And it's a miracle that our supply chains bring all of those parts together, and that vehicle lasts. Some of the vehicles on the road now are on average 12 or 13 years old and running just fine. So imagine having this for 12 or 13 years and it always runs, with minor maintenance and upkeep. I think this one's going to last about 2 years. So, and this is not the most complex thing I own. The thing sitting out in the driveway is, and mine's 10 years old. So, there's a lot of change, and I think another area I cover is the labor negotiations. We saw, this year when the UAW negotiated with the Detroit 3 automakers, a big push on getting greater involvement in technology. They've had ways to partner and be informed with about factory automation, but now they're getting much more involved in the product automation and the vehicle powertrain, because there's so many powertrain jobs at risk if we move to an electrified future, or as we move to an electrified future. So there's a lot going on. It's really interesting.
Absolutely.
And then you can put trade on top of that, and all the trade overlay, and how that may be changing some of the relationships as well.
Okay, so you're describing, I guess, what we might call digital transformation. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think I see there is that you're seeing new companies like Tesla and other electric mm-hmm. car companies growing up. Right. And you're seeing the traditional companies trying to compete with that. You mm-hmm. mentioned to us that a little bit when you talked about them merging together mm-hmm. and a lot of the investments that they're making. How effectively do you think the traditional companies are responding, and how do you think that's going to progress, the new companies versus the old companies, I guess?
Well, let's just take electrification for one. Our forecasts going out to 2040 show a large percentage of the electrified vehicles that are coming down the line. And in fact, the next 2 years is an explosion of models that are going to be electrified. There's going to be an electrified F-150 pickup truck, a battery electric version, as well as hybrid versions. So, but hybrid, plug-in hybrid, mild hybrid, so that's a 48-volt system. Those kinds of vehicles still have engines and transmissions in them, and they're much more complex to build, whereas battery electric is less complex to build, fewer moving parts. So I think, when we see, this electric future is coming, people think that has big workforce implications, but in the short term, it has, we need more workforce. But you're right. I mean, Tesla, I just saw a presentation yesterday from one of the commercial forecast firms, LMC Automotive, and they were showing a global view that currently in 2019, Tesla was making up about 19% of the 1.5 million vehicles sold that were battery electric. 4 of the top 10 firms in the battery electric space were Chinese firms, BYD, Geely, SAIC, firms like that, making up a huge proportion of electric vehicles now. They also showed a 2031 forecast. Tesla's 9% of the 17.3 million market globally for battery electric vehicles. So that's a great growth for Tesla, even though their share shrinks. But the big kahuna in 2031 was Volkswagen.
Oh.
They're making a huge bet coming out of the scandal that they had about diesel emissions cheating. That they were like, well, we're going to leapfrog and go to battery. And China is putting a lot of money into battery electric development and battery technology. The Korean government, Korea is the home of batteries. So Hyundai and Kia have strong showing and are going to have a big share. I think that their share is bigger than Ford's or General Motors in 2031. Hyundai is. The Japanese are looking at that and saying, they're going to battle this out over electric. We're going to put a big investment in fuel cell. Fuel cell, as long as I've been in the industry, is always 20 years away. It moves with me. I may retire and fuel cells will still be 20 years away, but the Japanese producers and Japanese government have decided that fuel cell is going to be where they will play. I think Tesla is pushing. They're pushing the. I don't want to say pushing the envelope, but I'm going to say pushing the envelope. They're really, showing that it can be done and showing that there's a market for an all-electric vehicle. It's a very different market, though, I think. People who buy a Tesla versus, I was, this summer I was driving a vehicle that General Motors makes, the CT6, that has their Super Cruise in it. So Super Cruise is level 2 automation, and Tesla is at level 2. These are the SAE levels of automated vehicle technologies. And I've driven the Tesla as well. I spent 2 weeks with the GM car, and you can find videos all over the internet of people driving Teslas with their hands off the wheel. There was a guy just this week who was driving on icy roads saying, "Oh, look how well my car's doing. Oh, I crashed." He was like, and it was, filming himself the whole time. Cadillac buyers don't do that. And Cadillac is the only system that the automaker says you can take your hands off the wheel. Tesla says you're supposed to keep your hands on the wheel. But I think that they're really, pushing technology and requiring that other companies respond and compete with that. Tesla's manufacturing's been a mess. They were making cars in a tent in a parking lot. To scale up to being 9% of the market by 2031, they're going to have many more facilities. And of course, they've just built the factory in China. They've are intent to build in Germany. I think they'll find the manufacturing environment in Germany is very different than China or the U.S. And the U.S. and California is fairly different than it would be here in the upper Midwest or Ontario, where we've got a long history of building vehicles. But these disruptions come, and it's caused the industry to have to be more reactive and think about, okay, they don't always want to be on their heels. What is the proactive leapfrogging moment? What do we do to get out in front of this? And that's why you see whole divisions within the traditional companies that are out looking for those startups, looking for those firms that have some secret sauce that they can buy. And there's I had an interview with one of the automakers, and they said, we have our culture. our culture within our company, and we're kind of slow and lumbering and safe, and we don't move fast and break things like Silicon Valley does. But we bought a group of Silicon Valley firms, and we kept them outside of our culture. We made a separate division to put them in. We put them in a separate buildings, and all of this to try to preserve some of their move fast and break things without. We don't want to change internally because we have to meet safety rules and fuel economy rules, and we've got, there's a reason why we're more conservative, but there's a reason why that Silicon Valley mentality moves technology and moves innovation. And so they're trying to find that blend between we've invested in these things, we've bought these things, we don't want them to corrupt us and we don't want to corrupt them, but we want to get the best of both.
So what you seem to be describing, I guess, is that for the traditional companies, they're trying to find their way in this new world, and that they are making changes that they think are appropriate and that will be successful for them in the future. And that as far as predicting or being able to forecast what might happen in the future, it's still a bit uncertain what the industry will look like in, say, 10 years or 15 years' time, as far as what the position of the traditional companies will be at that point, or even what the position of the new companies like Tesla will be. Will they be able to behave in the ways they need to reliably, economically produce cars?
Well, and Tesla is swinging quarter to quarter, really.
They're just down.
Watching the quarterly financials very, very closely, and what happens if they get a big recall, a service recall, and in many markets like in the state of Michigan, they have no dealers because their dealer model doesn't fit with our state franchise laws. So they have mobile Tesla repair places, and they're going to have, or you can take your car to Toledo if it's broken, because you can do it in Ohio, but you can't do it in Michigan. Big, costly recalls or lawsuits or, regulatory changes from NHTSA could be very damaging to that company. Wall Street loves them, and their stock price has been holding up. They're worth more than Ford or GM, and they're producing fairly well for their shareholders. But they're also with high returns comes some risk, and I think there's still some risk in their formula. It's encouraging. I think that the automakers, the traditional automakers, are making these big bets. They're also doing it through mitigation, doing it jointly or in a safer manner. There was a big debate on Twitter just yesterday about whether Sergio Marchionne was the most brilliant person ever to just sit back and say, I will buy the technologies I need. I'm not going to put all of my efforts and all of my eggs in these baskets because I don't have that many eggs for all of those baskets. And, quite frankly, the base vehicle that a lot of companies are using to test automation is a Pacifica. Those sliding doors are lovely. The stow and go seats means you got a big hole in the floor. You could put a lot of computing power and technology. So Windsor-made Pacificas are the Waymo fleet. And that, a couple of maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I was talking with some automakers, and they're like, well, we have to be investing in this because we don't want to be making the dumb boxes that other people put the technology in. The FCA strategy seems to be we're okay with making the dumb boxes because it's really hard to make these dumb boxes really well, as we've proven to Tesla. It's hard to be an automaker. It is hard to do this. And even the Chinese are finding, they're getting much, much better. I was at a Chinese auto show in late 2018, and I took my teenager with me, who's kind of a bit of a car nut. And while I was doing things I needed to do, he's walking around on the floor taking pictures of orange peel paint, panel gaps, all of the things that were on a show floor, which in the US or Canada, you would never see a show floor with any manufacturing defects at all. And he was just like, what are they doing, Mom? I'm like, they're still learning. They, but they are going to go fast. And, the Japanese came to North America with motorcycles, small cars, and now, they've taken over. The Koreans' pace to come to North America was much faster than the Japanese. I think the Chinese will beat the Koreans, too. They've learned a lot.
So, what does it mean for jobs? How have jobs been changing? Is technology going to change what it's like to work for a car company in the future?
For production work and skilled trades work, sort of blue collar jobs, I think there's still a lot of automation is great. And for things that are like a repeatable task that has to be the same, perfect every time, like running a bead of adhesive around your windshield. Automation, robots are great at that. And they're great at doing checking. One of the factories I was in last year, there were 4 different windshields that could be installed on the vehicle that was being made. And so the robot would come, scan barcode, go get the right windshield. The other one would come in and run the bead. They'd put it in, they'd take a picture of the installation to make sure like we had verification of that VIN with that installation, and they knew for warranty and recall purposes, they've got a new stream of data coming behind it. So for something that's like that and repeatable, it makes a lot of sense. But humans are infinitely programmable. They can do lots of things. And if the parts don't exactly fit right, they can tweak it. They don't have to be programmed to tweak everything. Humans are, this is the case with automated driving too. Humans are doing miraculous things while they are driving that, if all automated cars had to do was interact with other automated cars in a closed system, we could have full automated driving, right? Not interacting with pedestrians, not interacting with, weather or pets or human-driven vehicles. If there was, very low disruption factors in the system, it's easy to program to follow the rules and move around in the system. But we're going out into an environment on the road as a human driver that has deer that run across the street, black ice on the road, just all kinds of disruptions that humans are really good at detecting and reacting to that we're not good at programming. And we're using machine learning, billions of miles of simulation and driving on the road to try to capture what humans can do. But I think there was a big realization in 2019. These I refer to the SAE automation levels. They go from 0 to 5. That maybe 5 is a platonic ideal. Maybe we never get there. And me, from a business analyst standpoint, I think, well, if the average car on the road is 12 or 13 years old, how long does it take you to turn over the fleet to have more vehicles that have these automated features? And you need more of them to have it. Think of like vaccination kind of problem. So you want a population to get vaccinated to have protection from some disease. You need to have enough of them so that you have the herd protection. And so think of there are Markov models and things like that you can do to think about what that would do. But with the fleet turning over so slowly and vehicles being so durable, a lot of that protection is a long way away. Mm-hmm. And think about it from an insurance standpoint too. A vehicle that has many safety features, advanced driver assistance and all of that, it may not crash. But other things could crash into it, and when they do, that bumper full of sensors is really expensive to replace. Mm-hmm. So the vehicle itself may be safer, and maybe you get lower insurance rates, but they find in practice that, somebody slammed into you behind you because they didn't see you, and now you've got a bumper full of, sensors or LiDAR pucks or all sorts of things that are really not cheap to fix. So I think even when you see when this technology becomes available, in level 2 is here now, level 3s and 4s are predicted in the next 5 or 10 years, we're still going to be interacting with conventional safety systems and human drivers for a long time.
Do you see the changes that are happening now change the way labour relations are working in the automotive sector? Are the unions dealing with it effectively? Does this change what they need to do? Do you see anything happening there as a result of the changes?
Well, I think they're aware of those changes. They're trying to address those changes, but ultimately those decisions about product and process and investment in technology they're company decisions. So they're more being involved in how it's happening, not whether it's happening. They're negotiating for the training that they need to do this new work. In many factories, there was one where I saw a body shop that had become more highly automated, and they took the people who did that job, who knew how to tweak the system and knew all the had years on that job. They made them data analysts and taught them how to see those things that they were seeing in the process with their eyes when they were the operator, to see that in the data. And one of the things I think about is okay, so if I was I'm trying to think of something that I do fairly well. I knit. Okay, so I know how to knit. I know how to fix things. I know how to tweak things and make it work the way I want it to. But if I'm going to be now monitoring a knitting machine, because I know how to knit, I know what to do if the machine screws up. I know what to do if the data coming off the machine tells me that there's this problem. I've done it before manually. I can intervene. What happens with the next generation of workers who've never done it? And if you go to the German model of apprenticeships, if you're a printing apprentice, you learn how to print with like Gutenberg learned to print at first, and then you're going to be running digital printers. But they teach you Gutenberg printing first, so that you have that background. And that's a concern I think I have with as we introduce technology, is people need to have built things or know how it works in order to interact with it in the digital space. And think about another example is tool and die. So tool and die, very complex work. And people who have built a die, when the die breaks, know what to fix. Because of globalization in the industry, wages in other countries, other trade factors, a lot of tool and die for the auto industry is built in China. So the builds are now offshore, but they still break in Windsor or Ingersoll or Oakville or Detroit. So who's going to come from China and come fix it when it's broken? The person who built it, or do we need a local skilled tool and die build population that can fix those things that have been built elsewhere? And how do they learn to fix them if they've never built them? So it's a conundrum that comes up against purchasing versus as a long-term sustainability issue. So purchasing goes to where it's the cheapest to get it, but where's the budget for fixing it once it breaks? That's not out of purchasing, that's out of manufacturing. And right now there's plenty of old tool and die guys, mostly guys, who can come in and fix this, but they're going to retire. And then what do we do?
So what you're describing is a car manufacturing world where there will still be a need for a lot of manual skill.
Absolutely.
So the predictions that some people make, that's all going to disappear, and
it's always somewhere in the middle.
It will still be there somewhere.
The people who think it's never going to change and we're always going to need manual workers, that's going to change. People who think that's obsolete and we've got this brave new future, always look in the middle, because it's never exactly black and white. And so it's more complicated than that. And, labor is only about 5% of the cost of building a vehicle. It's the one, Jim Stanford, who used to be the chief economist at Unifor, always said, well, it's only 5%, so why are they getting so upset about this? I'm like, that's the 5% that the companies feel they have greater control over. They don't always control what's the price of material inputs. I mean, they are certainly big buyers of steel and aluminum and things like that, and can get some pricing power there, but they don't control that. They don't control, what the competition looks like and what they have to price their vehicles at. They don't control, all the railroads and the distribution system to get their vehicles to market. They sit down, and that contract with labor is one of the biggest purchasing contracts they negotiate, one of the most complex purchasing contracts they negotiate. And that they feel like they have control over.
Is there a need for government to, in some way, contribute to or make other decisions, perhaps, about the transformation? Does government have a role in enabling the automotive sector to change in a way that would be good for the industry and perhaps good for society too?
I think so. I think there's a lot of ways government interacts with the auto industry. In 2008 and 2009, we found that they were the saviors. Canadian, the U.S. government, many state governments came to General Motors and Chrysler's rescue, lots of comments around that about government motors and all this. But we've always been engaged with the government. Governments do economic development and put incentives on where plants may locate and try to move those decisions. They make, at the highest level, investments in technology. The Defense Department in the U.S., with the DARPA challenge, was really seeding that we were moving to an automated driving future. Making it important for defense meant that there was technologies developed that would have commercial applications later. The internet was developed for the Defense Department, so they certainly has commercial applications later. So I think there's some way out in the future stuff. They're important as a regulatory agencies to help determine what is safe to do and what is desirable. And then, if a government decides that it wants to have an auto industry, it can certainly do a number of things that will enable and support their suppliers and the automakers to provide good jobs. And, a job in the auto industry in North America is one of the most impactful jobs a community could have. So, an engineering job at an auto firm, well, they don't buy a lot of things from other outside companies, right? So there's a person making $130,000 US a year as a high-level engineer. There's no supply chain behind that. So all you get from that is they're going to spend that money and buy housing and medical care and food and things in the close local economy. So it's good to have a good-paying job that supports a lot of other dentists and daycares and things like that. But an assembly job has a supply chain behind it that is very long and deep. And one assembly plant job may support 7 or 8 other jobs in the economy. And not just locally when they spend their paycheck and, at the restaurants and things like that. But, we often talk about here in Michigan how dependent we are on the Canadian government or Canadian industry and vice versa. So, when General Motors said they were going to unallocate several plants, including the Oshawa plant, and the Michigan assembly plant was saved in the UAW negotiations, yay! Except for we had a lot of parts going on to Oshawa. And so the supply chain impacts here in Michigan are going to be significant if Oshawa is ultimately closed down. Now, of course, it's not building vehicles right now; it's doing other things for GM. But that's got a big feedback loop to us. So government has a huge role in making sure that they want an auto industry, supporting that, supporting job training and other aspects to making sure the industry can survive and thrive in their communities.
The focus for a lot of auto industry companies prior to the emphasis, I guess, or alongside the emphasis with technology, was around, lean systems, and I'm keen to understand how that emphasis works alongside the work they're doing with technology today. Are the two still happening together, or do you see them impacting each other? Are there changes happening in the way companies are organizing their production?
Not tremendously radically different ways of organizing production, but lean was a necessary step, I think, to enabling more nimble operations. So you can, if you're operating in a lean manufacturing environment, you don't have a warehouse full of parts that are have some issue. You can correct things and have more agile relationships with the suppliers, and I think that helps us move to a higher quality builds in the plants. And the plant technologies, a lot of this digitization and the merger of cyber physical is going to help us with quality and with warranty. And I mentioned that they took a picture of, here's your windshield installation, that there was all kinds of use of visual systems for checking, use of visual systems for documentation. So, sometimes when there's a recall now, they're like, well, we're going to recall all the vehicles built between here and here. They recall many more than they actually have to fix because they don't know exactly which ones have the part that needs the recall, or they don't know exactly which ones were affected by. They can be much more narrowly targeted if they have this data stream of documentation of which ones got that windshield wiper motor that's being recalled, or which ones got were made on at this particular time when this issue was occurring. So I think it's going to allow them to be much more surgical and save a lot of money on the back end, and also ensure the quality is built in from the beginning because they've got ways of documenting those systems. So I think lean is it's sort of like I've been in the industry since the 80s, and there used to be big quality gaps between the Detroit 3 and the international firms, and you measure that, and then you get what you measure. So it was tremendous progress, and a merger of everyone was at the same level of productivity and quality. Something called the Arbor report was measuring factory productivity. And you saw this just convergence of everybody. And at the last year that they published that report, Chrysler was the most productive plant in North America, productive automaker in North America, and they had been one of the worst. So everybody got to a standard of, this is the price of admission. You can't be in this market unless you have very high levels of quality, very high levels of productivity. And, lean, I think, helped get them to, very low levels of waste in the system, so that they can enable that next transformation to bringing technology and data together.
Another transformation that's happening would be in supply chains, presumably, as perhaps some suppliers, perhaps more associated with non-electric cars, may be declining. New suppliers related to electric cars and more technology in cars may be growing. Are you able to talk about how the ecosystem of the industry might be changing?
Sure. I think, there's a lot of suppliers of the big suppliers, so the ones we call tier ones that sell directly to automakers, have been diversifying too, and getting into different business lines and different business areas. And also I think there's been a change of emphasis too, or there will be a change of emphasis. So think about seating. Seating used to be done by the automakers themselves. They had cushion rooms, and they had the cut and sew done elsewhere, like in Mexico, and then they just put the seats together and slam them in the cars in the plant itself. At some point they said, we're not going to do that anymore, and they pushed that out to suppliers. And because it's seating, it's not that exciting, it's not got a lot of technology in it or whatever. But when you're no longer driving your car, the interior is going to take on a greater importance. And if a lot of people are sharing a car, the interior takes on a different importance. It's got a different duty cycle, really. I mean, there's somebody sitting in the seat of my car, half an hour a day, most days. So, how durable does that cover, the springs, the heater, all of those things have to be for somebody who's going to sit in the car for less than an hour a day. My capacity utilization of my car is very low. But if it's, a New York taxi cab, there's somebody sitting there all the time, they make different seats for that, right? And if it's going to be people who are mainly passengers, all of the people mainly passengers, then you might make a different interior for them, and really change that. So I think there's a change of the emphasis of which suppliers become more important, not just in that, but battery electric vehicles, great torque off the line, tremendous performance, but they're all kind of the same. So you're not differentiating the product anymore based on its performance or handling, because they're getting their batteries all from Panasonic or LG or something, these big companies. And how do you? Companies have been competing on their powertrain or their propulsion efficiencies or performance or things like that. That's not a competitive factor if everything is to battery electric, or a lot of vehicles move to battery electric. What's the competitive force then? Then you've got to move it to something else. Is it styling? Is it the customization of the vehicle? What is it that makes a Volkswagen different than a Honda versus different than a Ford? That it's going to change which suppliers are important. And then some of the new stuff is not, doesn't have a fully robust supply chain in North America yet. So LiDAR units are very important for a lot of the safety systems and for automation. They make these little LiDAR pucks now instead of the big spinny thing on the roof. But they're not commercially available really right now. And at some point they're going to have to start making 17 million of those a year in the United States and 2 point something million in Canada, and or enough to outfit that many vehicles. So that's part of the supply chain that's not yet fully robust, and I think we'll see a growth in those things. The new trade agreement in North America that was just ratified by the U.S. Congress yesterday. Hopefully Canada takes it over the line and we'll be back in business. But that drives a lot of, it really modernized trade in North America. The old NAFTA agreement had a set list of products. And this set list said, these are the things that we care about the content of the vehicle on. And everything else we're going to say is deemed originating. So, if it's not on this list, we're going to say, well, yeah, it probably came from North America, and not worry about it. There were things on the list like distributor caps and 8-track tape players, and they have a very not modern list. It did have some adjustments over time, so batteries were on there, but some parts of the vehicle were not. So the new schematic, or the way that they're dealing with this, is much more broadly encompassing of all vehicle technology and requires much higher levels of North American content in order to trade freely. So I think we will see more of that new technology, the LiDAR pucks and things like that, be built in North America in order to meet those free trade rules, because before it would have been deemed originating until it made it onto that tracing list.
Interesting. I got two final questions.
Okay.
The first one's probably impossible. I'm happy if you feel
I'll tell you.
No problem. And the second one is also I think a lot easier. But the first one is, if you were asked what the industry would look like in 10 years, what would you say?
I think there'll still be a lot of vehicle manufacturing in the U.S., Canada, Mexico. The vehicle has been the primary mode of transportation to work, at least in the U.S., for 40 years or more. It stayed about the same. It hasn't gone down. There are many, many more options of getting to work, but that trends more with population density and where if people are living in the cities versus living in the suburbs or more rural areas. And I don't think that we're going to see huge population shifts, at least in the U.S. I know in Canada there's big megacities like Toronto.
Bigger, yeah.
But we have a lot of our population that lives in various and sundry other places, and a lot of infrastructure that would need to be built out for charging or fuel cell recharging, and other enabling things that are the public funds are pretty tight. So in the next decade, I don't see a huge change in how people get around, and the price of electric and automated vehicles, like fully electric and fully automated vehicles, is going to remain out of the reach of a lot of our population. I think we're going to still be making cars. I think we'll have greater safety and greater automated driver automation features that people will be using. I don't think everybody's just going to sit back and sleep and driving becomes something that people don't do, at least not in the next 10 years. Our forecast for powertrain shows a lot of hybridization, and that means we're still going to be building engines and transmissions, but for the supply chain we may be building 3-cylinder or 4-cylinder engines instead of 6 or 8. So if you make valve lifters, you're going to be making half as many valve lifters. So your volumes are going to go down for things that are tied to the powertrain. And let's see what else. I don't know. I mean, this is a big, complicated industry, and disruption happens, and sometimes disruptors come and go without leaving much of a mark. But I think we're edging ever forward to greater electrification, greater automation, and we'll be a little further down the road in 10 years, but not radically different.
Very interesting. So my final question, some advice for the people who are going to be watching this. For a graduate today in an engineering or technology field, which is what most of the people will be in who will watch this, what advice would you have for them about working in the automotive industry?
It's really interesting. It's always changing. I'm an engineer too. And I haven't done engineering in a long time. It's very good to understand that. I think the big change that happens through all of this is having to have more cross-functional understanding, at least. So being able to think beyond the engineering problem to the budgetary problems, to the marketing issues, to the I know I've met with a number of powertrain engineer groups in the last decade or so, and they're like, yeah, we can make a car that gets 100 miles per gallon. No problem. Nobody could afford it. So some of the the constraints that are put on by building a car that is really a complex system. Engineers who understand things beyond engineering are going to have a greater career path for them. Engineers who can write and communicate and make persuasive arguments. Some of the things that, are probably, your non-core classes when you're in an engineering, those are really, really important once you get into business if you want to not spend your whole career as a line level engineer. So if you want to move up and be successful, I think, mastering finance, budgets, communication are really key.
I think fabulous advice, and this this video will help them to do that. The things that we've talked about are part of that understanding. So thank you, Kristin, for talking to me today. I really appreciate it, and
good luck, guys.